Get your hands off that terminal. That equipment is not for visitors. He didn't even look up when he said it, just kept scrolling through his phone, one hand waving in the general direction of the woman standing 3 feet from the server rack, like she was a stray dog that had wandered into the wrong building. The woman he was talking to was Naomi Osei-Boateng, 41 years old, lead architect of the entire network infrastructure that man was currently sitting inside of. She had designed the climate control system for that server room in 2019. She had written the security protocols he was using to badge in and out every morning. And she had, just 4 days prior, been named the incoming Chief Technology Officer of Hargrove Capital Group, the firm that owned the building, the servers, the badges, and the contract that paid his salary. She didn't say any of that. She just looked at him for a moment. Then, she took one step back and folded her hands in front of her. If you've ever watched someone get handed a rope and proceed to braid it into a noose for themselves, you know exactly what the next 40 minutes looked like. Let's go back to where this actually starts, because context matters here. Hargrove Capital Group was, at the time, one of the mid-tier financial services firms that most people outside of Atlanta had never heard of, but that quietly managed somewhere north of $4 billion in assets. They weren't flashy. They didn't need to be. The kind of clients they served: old money, multi-generational wealth, a few institutional investors. Didn't want flashy. They wanted consistent. They wanted secure. They wanted to know their data was locked down tighter than anything a competitor or a federal auditor could crack. That was where Naomi came in. She had spent 11 years building the digital backbone of companies like Hargrove. Not the visible stuff. Not the website or the app. The infrastructure underneath, the kind of architecture most executives couldn't explain, but absolutely could not function without. She had started as a network engineer at 24, made senior engineer by 28, left a comfortable position at a larger firm at 35 to go independent, and spent the next 6 years consulting for financial services clients across the Southeast. Hargrove had been her biggest contract, 18 months of work. She had restructured their entire data security framework after a near-miss breach that the previous IT vendor had handled badly. She had hired and trained the internal team. She had gotten them through 2 external compliance audits with 0 findings. And when the board decided to bring that function fully in-house and hire a permanent CTO, they had, after a search process that took the better part of a year, offered the position to Naomi. She had accepted on a Tuesday. The announcement was scheduled for the following Monday. This is Friday afternoon. She came into the building that afternoon to do a final walkthrough with the IT director, a quiet, competent man named Eugene Park, who had been on her team through most of the contract work, and who was, frankly, thrilled she was staying. They went through 3 floors, checked the new firewall deployment, reviewed the ticketing system queue, came down to sub-level 1, where the primary server room was located, and that is where they encountered Raymond Stokes. Raymond Stokes had been at Hargrove for 11 years. He was 53, had come up through the old IT administration side, back when the company's entire tech stack was being managed with tools that were outdated when he learned them. He was the kind of man who believed that longevity was the same thing as authority. 11 years. 22 years. What it meant to him was that he had been there longer than most of the people who now outranked him, and he had never fully made peace with that. He didn't know who Naomi was. He had seen her around the building over the past 18 months, obviously. But in his mind, and this is important, she had been filed under a category: consultant. Temporary. Not really staff. The kind of person who came in, moved things around, collected a check, and left. He had been politely dismissive of her the entire time, which she had noted and set aside because she had work to do. He did not know about the CTO announcement. Almost nobody did yet. So when Naomi walked into the server room with Eugene and began reviewing the rack configuration on the east wall, the same rack she had specced out and overseen the installation of, Raymond looked up from his workstation, looked at her hands near the terminal, and said what he said. "Get your hands off that terminal. That equipment is not for visitors." Eugene opened his mouth. Naomi put one hand out slightly, Just a small gesture, the kind that says, "Let me handle this," and Eugene closed his mouth. "I'm not a visitor," Naomi said. Her voice was completely even. Raymond finally put his phone down, looked at her properly for the first time. "Contractors aren't supposed to be down here without an escort from permanent staff." "Eugene is permanent staff," she said, gesturing toward Eugene, who was standing approximately 4 feet away holding a tablet. "Eugene isn't authorized to escort contractors into the primary server environment. That requires a department head or above." Naomi looked at Eugene. Eugene looked at the ceiling in the specific way that people do when they are trying very hard not to say something they will regret. "Who's the department head?" Naomi asked. Raymond straightened up a little. "For this level, that's me." She nodded slowly. "Then I suppose," she said, "you can escort us." Something shifted in Raymond's face. He had expected her to apologize, or to say she'd come back, or to defer in some way that confirmed his read of the situation. The fact that she had pivoted so cleanly and calmly, had essentially accepted his framing and then used it to stay exactly where she was, threw him, but only for a second. His ego stepped back in and handled it. "I don't think that's going to work," he said. He crossed his arms. "I'm going to need to see your contractor credentials and your access authorization for this level. If you're thinking that this is around the point where a reasonable person would simply explain the situation, would say, 'Raymond, I've been named the incoming CTO. Here's the documentation.' Let's not do this. I understand why you'd think that. But here's what you have to understand about the kind of quiet dignity Naomi Osei-Boateng had spent 4 decades building. She was not going to argue for her right to be in a room she had designed, with a man who had been dismissive of her for the better part of 2 years, while he stood there with his arms crossed, waiting for her to prove herself to him. She wasn't going to do it. She took her badge off her lanyard, held it out to him. He scanned it. The system beeped. He looked at the screen. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the screen again. Her access credentials, as of that morning, had been updated to reflect her incoming role. They showed the highest internal clearance level in the building, above Raymond's, above the IT directors, below only the CEO and the 2 board co-chairs. Raymond Stokes stared at that screen for a very long time. And then, because in his mind there had to be an explanation that wasn't the obvious one, he said, "This has to be a system error." Let me say that again, for the people in the back. The man looked at her credentials on his own system. Credentials he had just scanned himself. On equipment he claimed authority over, and his response was that the system must be wrong. Eugene Park made a sound that he very quickly converted into a cough. "I can call IT support," Naomi offered pleasantly. "I?" Raymond stopped. "No, I'll escalate this myself. This is a security issue. If someone's credentials have been modified without proper authorization, the modification was authorized," Naomi said, "by the board." Another pause. "Why would the board authorize?" He stopped again, started again. "The board doesn't manage individual access levels. That goes through department heads. Typically." "Yes," she agreed. This was an exception. Raymond Stokes was a man who had built his professional identity on knowing how things worked at Hargrove Capital Group. 11 years of knowing the processes, the hierarchies, the sign-off chains. He knew who authorized what. He knew what required board involvement and what didn't. He knew all of it, and what Naomi was telling him didn't fit into the picture he had. Somewhere underneath all that certainty, there was probably a part of his brain trying to fire a signal, trying to say, "Wait, board exception, highest clearance. Why would a contractor? What kind of contractor?" His certainty reached down and turned that signal off. "I'm going to need you to wait outside while I make some calls," he said. Naomi looked at Eugene. Eugene looked at the tablet in his hands. "Of course," she said. They stepped outside into the corridor. Naomi leaned against the wall and checked her phone. Eugene stood next to her. After about 10 seconds, he said very quietly, "You know you don't have to wait, right? You could just—" "I know," she said. "He's going to be so." "I know," she said again. And there was something in her voice that wasn't amusement exactly, but wasn't not amusement either. Now, if you're watching this, and you've ever been in a position where someone with less authority than you treated you, like you needed their permission to exist in a space you had every right to. If you've been told to wait outside, to prove yourself, to justify your presence to someone who had already decided what you were, you know what this corridor moment feels like. You know the particular steadiness required to stand there and let it play out. Hit that like button if you've been in a corridor like this one. We'll be right back. Inside the server room, Raymond Stokes was making calls. The first one went to the IT director's supervisor, a man named Alan Fitch, who was in a meeting. Alan's assistant said he'd call back. The second one went to human resources, where he reached a coordinator who, when Raymond explained that he was calling about a contractor's unauthorized credentials escalation, asked him to hold. The coordinator came back 2 minutes later and said, in a very careful voice, "Can I ask, are you referring to Ms. Osei-Boateng?" "I don't know her name," Raymond said. "She's a contractor. She's been working on the security infrastructure project." A pause on the line. "Mr. Stokes," the coordinator said, "I think you might want to speak directly with Mr. Whitmore's office." Kenneth Whitmore was the CEO of Hargrove Capital Group. Raymond's certainty flickered. "Why would I? Is there some kind of HR issue I need to be aware of?" "I'd really recommend you reach out to his office directly," the coordinator said. And there was something in her tone. Not quite a warning. More like someone pointing very gently at a door and not wanting to be the one responsible for what was behind it. Raymond hung up. He stood in the server room for a moment. He looked at the terminal where Naomi's badge data had displayed. He pulled it up again, looked at the clearance level. Then he opened his email. In his inbox sent the previous afternoon was a company-wide email from Kenneth Whitmore's office. He had received it and not read it. He had 47 unread emails from that inbox because he read the subject lines and decided which ones needed his attention. The subject line on this one had said, "Leadership Update, Hargrove Capital Group Technology Division." He opened it now. He read it. He stood very still. In the corridor, Naomi felt her phone buzz. A text from Eugene. He just opened the announcement email. "I can see his screen from here." A few seconds later, "Oh, he's just standing there." And then, "He's coming to the door." Raymond Stokes opened the server room door. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Naomi Osei-Boateng. She looked back at him. He had prepared, somewhere in the time between reading the email and opening the door, some version of a graceful recovery. Something professional. Something that acknowledged the situation without fully acknowledging it. He was going to be matter of fact. He was going to say that he'd sorted out the credential question, and they were welcome to continue the walkthrough. What came out instead was, "Why didn't you just tell me?" Naomi tilted her head slightly, the way a professor does when a student asks a question that reveals they have not been paying attention. "Would it have mattered?" she asked. And Raymond Stokes, to his credit, did not answer immediately. He stood in that doorway for a moment, with the question sitting in the air between them. And whatever he was thinking in that moment, whether it was the right thing or some version of the wrong thing, dressed up to look right, he didn't say it out loud. He stepped back and held the door open. Naomi and Eugene walked back into the server room. The official transition into the CTO role happened over the following 3 weeks. The board did their public announcement on Monday morning, as scheduled. There were congratulatory emails. There was a welcome lunch. There were introductory meetings with department heads across every division. Raymond Stokes sent a congratulatory email. It was 4 sentences long and formally correct in every respect. Naomi read it, noted it, and moved on. But what happened in the weeks after that mattered too, because this is not a story where the resolution is just the moment of revelation, and then everybody moves on as if nothing happened. Life at a company is not a story that ends when the dramatic scene does. Raymond Stokes, it turned out, had a pattern. The server room incident was visible because Naomi had been there for it. But Eugene Park, once the dust settled and things felt safe enough to say, told Naomi about 3 other contractors he had watched Raymond treat the same way over the past 2 years. One of them was a black woman who had been brought in as an external compliance auditor. Raymond had asked her, twice, if she needed directions to the parking validation machine. She had been there to evaluate whether Hargrove's data practices met federal standards for institutional clients. She had found 3 findings that the previous auditor had missed. Raymond had never asked the white male contractors for their parking validation. This is not a complicated pattern to identify once you start looking for it. Naomi did not fire Raymond Stokes in her first week. That would have been too easy, and it also would have been the wrong move operationally. He had institutional knowledge that needed to be properly documented and transferred, and the timing wasn't right. What she did instead was implement something that Raymond had resisted for 2 years: mandatory access log reviews. Every level of the building, every badge scan, a monthly report that went, from now on, directly to her office. She also required that all contractors receive a formal welcome orientation before their first building access was approved, including a written overview of their scope of work, their clearance level, and a point of contact on the internal team. Not because contractors needed to be managed more tightly, because the people greeting them needed to know who was walking through the door. 2 months later, during a performance review cycle that had been scheduled before Naomi ever set foot in the CTO role, Raymond Stokes received an evaluation that documented, for the first time in his 11 years at the company, specific behavioral concerns. The documentation referenced incidents reported by other staff members. It referenced Eugene Park's account. It referenced the access log data. It was thorough and it was fair, and it gave him a clear remediation path. He resigned 6 weeks after receiving it. He sent Naomi a second email on his last day. It was longer than the congratulatory one. Whether it said the right things for the right reasons, only Raymond Stokes knows. Naomi read it, acknowledged it, and did not share what was in it. That was between them. What I can tell you is what happened in the months after that. Naomi spent her first year at Hargrove restructuring the technology division in a way that permanently changed how the company thought about who had knowledge and who had authority. She brought in 2 new hires who between them had been dismissed or underestimated in their previous roles in ways that the people dismissing them came to regret. She established a mentorship pipeline with 3 HBCUs in Georgia that funneled early career talent directly into paid positions at Hargrove. She also, at some point in that first year, had a framed print installed in her office. It was not inspirational. It did not have a quote on it. It was a photograph, taken in black and white, of the server rack on sublevel 1. The first one she had ever designed for a Hargrove installation. The one she had been standing next to when a man told her to get her hands off the terminal. She looked at it sometimes when the work got heavy, not as a reminder of where she came from or what she had overcome, more as a reminder of the particular steadiness required to stand in a corridor and let the truth do what only the truth can do. The truth doesn't need you to argue for it. It just needs you to be patient enough to let it arrive. If you're watching this right now and you've been in that server room, or in that corridor, or in any version of a moment where someone looked at you and decided what you were before you ever said a word, this story is for you. You didn't need anyone to confirm what you already knew about yourself, but it helps, sometimes, to watch someone else hold the line. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time you stayed quiet and let the truth speak for itself. And if this is your first time here at Lineage Tales, there's more where this came from. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.